The terms primary and secondary sources might sound like jargon, but they make an important part of understanding historical research. Hey, Cypher here. Historians have to differentiate between the types of sources that they use. Sometimes in their bibliographies, they even differentiate between primary and secondary sources. But what is the difference? Obviously, a source is any materials you gather while researching. But that can be anything. So let's imagine that we're trying to research the Russian intervention, kind of one of my favorite subjects and something that I've actually already made an episode on. When I was writing my article on the British decision to intervene in the Russian Civil War, I used a separated bibliography, as you can see scrolling down the screen right now. That's a lot, right? You see how it is separated by primary and secondary sources? Here's why. Primary sources are original materials. Just as scientists gather experimental data for their research, historians gather newspapers, memoirs, diaries, manuscripts, imagery, artifacts, and pretty much anything else you can imagine. Primary sources are unfiltered, and that's why historians use them as evidence. In the case of my study into the Russian intervention, I was reading the British cabinet's documentation on their actual arguments over what to do about the Russian Civil War. But as you saw in the bibliography before, I had a lot more than just cabinet documents as primary sources, because you can't just use one primary source. These sources are meant to serve as evidence for the historian. In my article, I was saying that the British didn't really have any clue what they were doing and acted purely out of confusion. I used their bickering back and forth and their actual statements on their own confusion as evidence. Secondary sources, on the other hand, is what people have written after the fact. This is any material that is using primary sources as evidence. That means that they can't be cited as direct evidence themselves. Secondary sources are mostly comprised of other history books, but they can be sociologists, philosophers, politicians, or even newspapers just to make it confusing. It just has to do with whether the source is evidence or is citing evidence. So in my bibliography that was scrolling before, most of the secondary sources are other historians. There is one final type of source that normally doesn't get mentioned, and that is the tertiary source. These are sources that are not directly talking about the subject that you're researching. It could be something like a good poem that you quote, or a philosopher who makes a similar argument to what you're making, so you use it to bolster your own. These sources aren't directly involved with your subject matter, so they're tertiary. Here is the ultimate example though. In this book there are two articles that I use in my bibliography. It is simultaneously a primary and a secondary source. The primary source is a direct account from an officer who served in the Russian intervention. But immediately preceding it is basically the first history written of the subject. That one is a secondary source because it is using evidence rather than being evidence. So why read secondary sources at all? Well, I'll answer that in another episode on historiography. Go ahead and check it out, but don't forget to subscribe while you're here. I'll see you next time.